Conflicting accounts of the success of the United States bombing of nuclear sites in Iran last weekend. The intervention precipitated the end of a 12-day war between Israel and Iran. But whether or not it ended Iran's nuclear program is another question. The Pentagon today presented the operation as a historic success, while Iran's supreme leader claimed that it was all political theater with no bigger impact than the craters and rubble it left. Here's what both sides have been saying.
President Trump directed the most complex and secretive military operation in history, and it was a resounding success, resulting in a ceasefire agreement and the end of the 12-day war. There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities.
The President of the United States made an unusual exaggeration in describing what had happened. It became clear that he needed this exaggeration. Anyone who heard those words understood that beneath the surface of those remarks, there was another underlying truth. They couldn't do anything. They couldn't achieve their intended goal.
Well, the full scale of the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure is only beginning to come into focus. Satellite images show heavy damage at 3 key sites: Natanz, Fordo, and Esfahan, all central to Iran's uranium enrichment program. But questions remain. Was the core of Iran's nuclear capability actually destroyed, or did Tehran manage to shield its most critical assets? Well, as both sides claim victory, new evidence is complicating the picture.
The Natanz nuclear facility under attack. The centerpiece of Iran's nuclear program, bombed first by Israel, then by the U.S. Satellite photos show extensive damage to Natanz after Israeli and U.S. strikes. This bomb crater is directly on top of critical underground facilities. The Fordo nuclear site was also struck and shows widespread destruction on the surface, as does a third location, the Isfahan storage facility. But despite the use of so-called bunker-busting bombs that can penetrate deep underground, it's unclear just how much damage was done where enrichment happens and high-grade uranium fuel is stored. Enrichment is the key to taking uranium to weapons-grade purity. Natanz was home to thousands of centrifuges used to enrich nuclear fuel. Centrifuges are delicate machines that are sensitive to vibrations. Analysts say the shock of a bomb blast could have destroyed Iran's enrichment capabilities without collapsing the sites. Replacing those centrifuges will take time. How long, we don't know. Iran's stockpiles of enriched fuel may have been moved before the U.S. bunker-busting strike. These satellite photos show trucks lined up near the Fordo site days before it was hit. They may have been transporting uranium out, or they could have been bringing dirt to seal the site off. Many of Iran's nuclear scientists have been targeted. Israel claims to have killed at least 14 top nuclear researchers, including the 2 senior scientists who led the program and had the most institutional knowledge. That could set the program back more than the loss of equipment and damage to sites. There's no telling when the world will know for sure just how much damage has been done. After the first Trump administration pulled out of the nuclear deal with Iran in 2018, Iran suspended much of the international oversight of its program. Now, its legislature has passed a measure to pull out of monitoring by the International Atomic Energy Agency. And no inspectors have been allowed access to the sites since the bombing campaign began.
But we can talk about all of that with our correspondent, Janelle Dumalaon in Washington, D.C. So let's start with the government's argument here. What evidence has Hegseth provided to prove that there's been a total obliteration, as he says?
Well, evidence evidence might be a strong word. What Hegseth leaned on heavily to support his claims of total obliteration was a lot of rhetoric, him pushing back against that initial report by the Pentagon's intelligence arm, that report that you mentioned that said that Iran's nuclear program was only set back by a couple of months. He also cited other assessments delivered by other intelligence chiefs within the Trump administration, like Tulsi Gabbard of DNI and John Ratcliffe of the CIA, that they both said that the facilities were indeed severely destroyed and that Iran would need years to rebuild its nuclear program. And Hegseth basically framed any sort of attempt to question the efficacy of these strikes as efforts to undermine President Donald Trump. But standing there with him was also General Dan Kane of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He showed reporters AI modeling of the blast, and what Kane said was that based on what he knew about what the weapons could do and the fact that these 30,000-pound bombs all hit their targets, then to him that did mean that the strike brought about severe damage. Now, noting that he did not say obliterated the way that Hegseth and Trump has, but he also said that he would defer to the intelligence community for final battle damage assessment, saying that if he were to do it, that would be akin to, in his own words, the military grading its own homework.
And looking at the political element of things here, why do you think it's so important for the Trump administration to show strength on this issue?
Well, for many reasons, it's important for the U.S. to show Iran the consequences of pursuing a nuclear weapon and what the American military could do. But of course, domestically speaking, it's also very important for Trump to be able to sell this to the American people as a one-and-done strike that accomplished its goal in one fell swoop. And that is, of course, dismantling Iran's ability to make a nuclear weapon, as opposed to something that would entangle the U.S. in a forever war that brings up the specter of Iraq and Afghanistan, both, of course, very unpopular with the American people.
Thank you so much for that analysis. We've been speaking with Janelle Dumalaon in Washington. I'd like to welcome Jeffrey Lewis, an expert on non-proliferation and arms control at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on this. We are getting conflicting accounts of how much damage U.S. strikes actually did to Iran's nuclear program. Is it possible for you to say which version of events is more likely?
Well, I think what we can do is describe the evidence that's available to us and say whether it sort of lines up more with one side or the other. And I think if I was just to sum it up, what I would say is that the facilities that were struck were damaged very severely. What I think a lot of the dispute arises from is the fact that there are many facilities that were not struck. And then now we have a debate about the relative importance of the things that were destroyed versus the things that were not.
And what about the Fordo site specifically? What is your assessment there? And also, maybe you could just tell us how one goes about assessing how successful strikes are, especially with no inspectors allowed on site.
Right. It's going to be very difficult to know what happened at Fordo before someone actually gets inside. For the United States military, what they're going to do is they have a model of the facility. And that model tells them that if they hit a certain place with a certain amount of force, that it's likely to destroy the facility. But that model could be right, that model could be wrong. But they know that they did do what they intended to do. When we come and look at it with, say, a commercial satellite image of the sort that's being shown on television, what we do is we look for changes in the ground that might indicate very severe damage, like the underground hall collapsing. So, one thing is the Iranians stuffed soil and other things into the tunnel entrances. If the tunnel had collapsed, you might expect to see that material blown out. We don't see that, and so it looks to us externally like the facility was probably very severely damaged, but we're certainly not in a position to say that it was destroyed.
And we do have a report from the Financial Times. They seem to have spoken to some of the Europeans and are reporting that Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile remains largely intact because it was not at Fordo at the time of the U.S. bombing. Do we have any idea where it could be? This is a really serious question if it's not in Fordo.
Well, it mostly wasn't in Fordo. I mean, I think this is a thing that arises from people not fully understanding how the program is configured. There is enrichment at Fordo, and they do accumulate enriched uranium, but then mostly it is shipped to another location near Isfahan. And while those underground tunnels were very lightly attacked, there was no effort to destroy those tunnels. And just like at Fordo, the Iranians had time to come with trucks and seal the tunnels. So, that material could be anywhere now. It could still be sitting in the tunnels. It could be in some storage site, or it could be at the enrichment facility that Iran announced the day before the war, which is not yet complete, but which does exist. And it may well be sitting there waiting to be re-enriched. I think the answer is we just don't know.
And at this stage, after the ceasefire that seems to be holding, does Iran have any incentive to be transparent with international investigators about where it is?
Well, I think we've already seen that the Iranian parliament has said that it's suspending cooperation with the IAEA. I think the Trump administration has some hope that the impact of the bombing campaign will be that Iran will return to negotiations. I think some of the early things we're hearing from the Iranians suggest that if they do come back, they're not going to be really all that cooperative. I think it really comes down to how the Iranians want to play this. They retain a significant capability to restart their nuclear program and make a nuclear weapon if that's what they want to do. But it's really going to be up to them to decide whether they want to take that chance or not.
And given what you've just said there, where does this leave things going forward in the future? I'm wondering how bad this is for international efforts to try to limit its program.
This is, I think, a catastrophe. I mean, what has happened is we took a threat that we had, which was the threat to use military force, and now we've executed it. And I think it's clear at the end of it that the Islamic Republic remains in power. You have the same regime you had at the beginning of the war. That regime still has access to stockpiles of centrifuges, nuclear material, the ability to build more centrifuges, and underground facilities, which, by the way, they now know are too deep to be targeted. So, I think that the Iranians have really, on the one hand, suffered a lot of damage, but at the end of it, they realized that they could survive that. So, I think that our ability to coerce Iran is probably not as strong as it was before this started.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today on DW with your insights. It's been a fascinating conversation with Jeffrey Lewis. And I would like to extend a warm welcome now to Jennifer Kavanagh, a senior fellow and director of military analysis at Defense Priorities. That is a foreign policy think tank that champions a more restrained U.S. role in global affairs. So we've just heard there from an expert who says he does not believe that Iran's stocks of highly enriched uranium have actually been destroyed. So what then did the U.S. accomplish militarily?
Well, certainly the U.S. strikes combined with the Israeli campaign over the past 2 weeks set Iran's nuclear program back. At the very least, the major enrichment facilities were severely damaged, and they probably can't be used right now, potentially ever, to enrich uranium. That doesn't stop the program, as Dr. Lewis suggested. The highly enriched uranium stockpiles, centrifuge components, and most importantly, the intellectual property that Iran has and the scientists and engineers ready to reconstitute the program are all still there. So what the military strike really did was buy the United States time to return to what is the only way to effectively address Iran's nuclear program with any finality, which is diplomacy and political solutions.
But now that the U.S. has shown that it is willing to use military force, does it make it harder to convince Iran that diplomacy is still an option?
Absolutely. The initial Israeli air campaign started just days before the United States and Iran were scheduled to meet again in their very productive series of talks working towards an agreement. So a return to diplomacy will be very difficult because Iran really has no reason to believe that the United States is acting in good faith and is credibly committed to diplomacy. The other challenge is that what the United States is asking for, which is for Iran to give up its enrichment capabilities, would leave Iran less secure. And so the Iranian leaders need credible assurances that giving up those weapons isn't going to then just leave them exposed for the next round of Israeli or U.S. strikes that could be aimed at broader goals like regime change. And it will be very difficult for the Trump administration now to provide those credible signals and credible assurances that give Iran confidence that it can compromise without being taken advantage of.
Are there credible assurances that Trump could give to the Iranians? Also, I'm particularly curious about their sway over the Israelis, if Trump would be able to, say, rein in Netanyahu should they seek to strike Iran again.
Well, that is one of the biggest challenges, is that any credible assurance that the United States gives has to cover not only U.S. behavior, which is hard enough, given U.S. history and given the fact that our presidential administrations change every 4 years, but also has to extend to Israel, which has proven to be willing to act unilaterally, and which often, at least in this case, is able to act even with sort of limited support from the United States. So there are credible assurances, but they're politically difficult. So with the case of Israel, the United States would have to signal clearly that it is willing to limit offensive military aid to Israel should it try to strike Iran again. So that would mean limiting precision missiles and bombs that Israel relies on. This wouldn't necessarily stop an Israeli campaign, but it would at least limit its scope. But that's politically difficult. That's a charged issue in the United States. In terms of other options for offering these types of assurances, one would be sanctions relief. And we've already seen a little bit of movement and discussion about this. But it would have to be real, significant, generous sanctions relief that starts soon as the two parties come to the table, really. That would probably require buy-in from the Europeans and might not be all that popular among some of the more hawkish members of the U.S. Congress. The other move that the Trump administration should and has started to make is to disavow any aim of regime change with Iran. We saw President Trump over the weekend muse about this and then kind of walk it back. In order to be credible, the United States would not only have to say this again and again and again, but also change its military posture in the region to make it clear that it was serious about realigning its global posture away from the Middle East rather than setting up for another long-term war against Iran. And these are all hard moves to make, but they will be necessary if the Trump administration hopes to get a real lasting deal with Iran. But the other important point here
Sorry,
is
if I could just jump in, I just wanted to ask you if you think there is even consensus within the Trump administration regarding its language and posturing on pushing for regime change in Iran.
I think most members of the Trump administration are pretty set against regime change because they understand that it would require a much more significant U.S. military presence and a long-term U.S. military campaign to do it successfully. And even then, it might not be successful. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan, where we tried to change regimes, required hundreds of thousands of U.S. forces, and still wasn't successful. There's really no appetite for that in the United States, as well as within the regime change, within the administration, More generally, I read President Trump's statement a little bit here as he would, of course, the United States would like to see regime change in Iran, but are unwilling to pay the costs. The question, though, is how the Israelis feel. They have indicated a much more significant interest in regime change and a willingness to try to pursue it with their striking of regime targets over the past couple of weeks.
And just very briefly, before we're out of time, I think you had one more example of ways that the U.S. could provide credible assurances, perhaps something constructive that you could suggest here?
Well, I think the final point I would make here is that the most important thing here is patience. This will take time. And I think that there's this idea that we need bombs or a deal. That's kind of how Trump has set this up. And I think now that the administration has bought itself some time by setting back Iran's nuclear program, there is no urgency. There is no imminent threat. And that gives time for any sort of diplomacy to take effect. And that patience hasn't always been President Trump's strong suit. So it's something that will really have to be in effect here.
That's a really important point. Thank you so much for joining us today with your insights. It's been a fascinating chat with Jennifer Kavanagh of Defense Priorities.
Thank you.